November 21, 1944, 1742 hours. The East China Sea, 250 kilometers southwest of Shanghai. Captain Atsushi Orita stood on the bridge of Japanese submarine I-26, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars as his vessel surfaced to charge batteries after 14 hours submerged. The sea was calm, the sky was darkening, and somewhere beneath them, carried by currents that had flowed unchanged for millennia, were the bodies of 1,800 men, women, and children who had drowned exactly 3 weeks earlier when Orita's submarine torpedoed the prison ship Suez Maru without knowing what it carried. But Orita didn't know that yet. He wouldn't know for hours when his radio operator intercepted Allied broadcasts describing the massacre. He wouldn't understand the full horror until after Japan surrendered and Allied investigators showed him photographs of corpses washing ashore on Chinese beaches, bodies of Allied prisoners of war who'd been locked in the holds when his torpedoes struck. And he would never learn the darkest irony of all, that the very submarine he commanded, the I-26 that had just committed one of the worst maritime disasters of the Pacific War, would sink itself through mechanical failure caused by its own design flaws exactly 47 days later, taking Orita and his entire crew to the same ocean floor where their victims had settled. The sea, it turns out, keeps its own accounts, and sometimes, in ways that seem almost supernatural, it balances them. This is the story of I-26, a Japanese submarine that achieved spectacular victories, sinking an American aircraft carrier, destroying dozens of merchant ships, terrorizing Allied shipping lanes from Hawaii to Australia. But it's also the story of a weapon that was fundamentally flawed, a crew that was doomed from the day they boarded, and a captain who discovered too late that some targets shouldn't be hit, some orders shouldn't be followed, and some weapons turn on the people who wield them. Japanese submarine I-26 was commissioned on November 6, 1941, exactly 1 month before Pearl Harbor. She was a Type B-1 fleet submarine, one of the most advanced undersea weapons in the world at that time. 377 feet long, displacing 2,600 tons surfaced, armed with 6 torpedo tubes and a 140-millimeter deck gun capable of traveling 14,000 nautical miles without refueling. On paper, she was magnificent. In reality, she was a death trap waiting to spring. The Type B submarines were designed for long-range operations in the vast Pacific, intended to interdict American supply lines, scout ahead of the combined fleet, and conduct reconnaissance missions thousands of miles from Japan. They were huge, larger than most American fleet submarines, with spacious quarters, air conditioning, and even a small bakery to provide fresh bread during extended patrols. But that size created problems. The submarines were slow to dive, nearly 60 seconds from surface to periscope depth, compared to 30 seconds for American fleet boats. They were less maneuverable underwater. Their large hulls created significant hydrodynamic drag, and most critically, their diesel engines were temperamental, complex, and prone to catastrophic failure. The Mitsubishi-designed diesel engines that powered I-26 were marvels of engineering. 2 12-cylinder units producing 4,700 horsepower each, giving the submarine a surface speed of 23.5 knots. But they required constant maintenance, perfect fuel quality, and careful operation. Push them too hard, let maintenance slip, or use contaminated fuel, and they would seize, overheat, or, in the worst case, explode. Captain Atsushi Orita took command of I-26 in October 1941. He was 34 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima with previous experience commanding smaller coastal submarines. He was competent, careful, and by all accounts, personally decent. Not one of the fanatical militarists who dominated Imperial Japanese Navy leadership. He followed orders, trusted his crew, and believed in the mission. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the submarine he commanded had a critical design flaw in its engine cooling system that would eventually kill everyone aboard. The flaw was subtle, a metallurgical issue in the cooling pipes that caused them to corrode from the inside, gradually restricting coolant flow. The problem took months to develop, was invisible during standard inspections and would only manifest catastrophically when the engines were pushed to maximum power for extended periods. I-26 had been in service for 3 years by November 1944. She'd completed 8 war patrols, traveled over 100,000 nautical miles, and her engines had been pushed far beyond their design specifications. The cooling pipes were degrading. The time bomb was ticking, but nobody knew. The submarine's war record was impressive and horrifying in equal measure. On December 7, 1941, I-26 was part of the submarine force that patrolled around Hawaii during the Pearl Harbor attack. She didn't participate directly in the air raid, but provided reconnaissance and was positioned to intercept any American carriers that attempted to return to Pearl Harbor. 3 weeks later, on December 27th, I-26 fired 3 torpedoes at the American aircraft carrier USS Saratoga off Hawaii, scoring 1 hit that caused severe damage and forced the carrier to return to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Saratoga was out of action for 5 months, a significant blow to American carrier strength in the critical early months of the war. That success earned Orita a commendation and established I-26's reputation as a dangerous, effective submarine. Over the next 3 years, she would sink 16 confirmed merchant ships totaling over 80,000 tons, damage several warships, and conduct reconnaissance missions that provided valuable intelligence to Japanese command. But submarine warfare in the Pacific was different from the Atlantic. Japanese submarines were primarily tasked with attacking warships, enemy carriers, battleships, cruisers. They were fleet submarines, meant to operate in conjunction with surface forces. Attacking merchant shipping was considered secondary, almost dishonorable compared to engaging enemy warships. This doctrinal preference had strategic consequences. While American submarines were systematically strangling Japan's economy by destroying merchant shipping, Japanese submarines focused on warships that were heavily defended and rarely vulnerable. American submarines in the Pacific sank over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, roughly 5 million tons. Japanese submarines sank fewer than 200 Allied merchant ships. The strategic math favored the Americans overwhelmingly, but Japanese naval doctrine, rooted in samurai tradition and decisive battle theory, never adapted. Submarines like I-26 spent their war hunting for rare, valuable targets, while American submarines destroyed Japan's ability to feed its population and supply its military. By late 1944, Japan was losing catastrophically. The Marianas had fallen. The Philippines were being invaded. American submarines and aircraft had reduced Japanese merchant shipping to barely functional levels. Fuel was scarce, food was scarce, ammunition was scarce. The combined fleet was a shadow of its former strength, husbanding its few remaining operational carriers and battleships because there was no fuel to operate them. In this desperate context, I-26 received orders for what would be her final patrol. She was to operate in the East China Sea and South China Sea, interdicting Allied shipping routes between Australia and China, attacking targets of opportunity, and, if possible, gathering intelligence on Allied naval movements. Captain Orita and his crew of 94 men departed Kure Naval Base on October 28, 1944. The submarine was loaded with 18 Type 95 torpedoes, full fuel tanks, and provisions for a 60-day patrol. The crew was experienced, many had been aboard since commissioning, and morale was reasonably good despite the dire strategic situation. The patrol began uneventfully. I-26 transited south along the Japanese coast, submerged during daylight to avoid Allied aircraft, surfaced at night to charge batteries and make better speed. By November 3rd, she'd reached her patrol area and began hunting. The first week produced no contacts. Allied shipping in the region had become scarce and cautious, traveling in convoys with destroyer escorts, following unpredictable routes, equipped with radar and sonar that made submarine attacks dangerous. Orita grew frustrated. His orders required results, but the ocean seemed empty. On November 18, 1944, lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. Orita ordered the submarine to periscope depth and began tracking the target. What he saw was a large merchant ship, approximately 5,000 tons, traveling alone, without visible escort, making 10 knots on a course toward Formosa. What Orita couldn't see, had no way to see, was that the ship was Suez Maru, a Japanese freighter that had been requisitioned for transporting Allied prisoners of war from the Philippines to forced labor camps in Manchuria and mainland Japan. In her holds, crammed into spaces designed for cargo, not humans, were 1,800 prisoners, Americans, British, Dutch, Australians, men captured in the Philippines, Singapore, Java. They'd been down there for days, given minimal food and water, breathing air so foul that men were passing out, dying slowly from heat and dehydration even before the torpedoes came. The ship flew no markings indicating it carried prisoners. International law required such markings, but Japan ignored it. Japanese doctrine held that prisoners of war had no honor, deserved no consideration, and revealing their locations would help enemy intelligence. So Suez Maru sailed unmarked, looking exactly like any other Japanese merchant ship. Orita positioned I-26 for attack. He calculated firing solutions. He ordered tubes loaded. And at 14:22 hours on November 18, 1944, he gave the order, Fire 1, Fire 2. Two Type 95 torpedoes left I-26's tubes at 5-second intervals, running at 49 knots toward the freighter 1,500 meters away. Time to impact, 61 seconds. Orita watched through the periscope, counting seconds. At 59 seconds, the first torpedo struck Suez Maru amidships on the port side. The explosion was massive. The torpedo had hit near the boiler room, rupturing steam lines and punching a hole 8 meters wide. The ship shuddered, listed immediately to port, and began settling. The second torpedo struck 12 seconds later, hitting near the stern. Another massive explosion. The ship's back broke. The stern section began separating from the midsection. And in the holds below, 1,800 prisoners who'd been locked in darkness suddenly found themselves in a flooding metal tomb. The Japanese crew aboard Suez Maru panicked. They abandoned ship immediately, lowering boats, throwing life rafts, saving themselves. Nobody unlocked the hold hatches. Nobody released the prisoners. Whether this was deliberate murder, panic-driven abandonment, or simply forgetting about the prisoners in the chaos, historical records can't definitively say. What is certain is that within 8 minutes, Suez Maru sank in 800 meters of water. Of the 1,800 prisoners aboard, fewer than 500 made it out of the holds. The rest drowned in darkness, trapped behind locked hatches as seawater rose around them. Orita watched the ship go down through his periscope. He saw lifeboats and survivors in the water. Standard practice at this point in the war would be to surface and machine gun survivors. Brutal, but common practice by both sides. Instead, Orita ordered, dive to 90 meters, silent running, depart area. He didn't know he'd just killed 1,300 Allied prisoners. He thought he'd sunk a legitimate military target, and he wanted to escape before any escorts arrived.
I-26 remained submerged for 6 hours, running south at slow speed to avoid detection. That evening, after surfacing to charge batteries, the radio operator picked up Allied broadcasts discussing a maritime disaster. Reports of a prison ship sunk with heavy casualties, survivors washing ashore, accusations of war crimes. Orita listened to the reports with growing horror. He checked his navigation logs, compared positions, and realized the ship he'd sunk matched the description. He'd torpedoed a prison ship. He'd killed Allied prisoners of war. Japanese naval law was complex regarding prisoners. Attacking them wasn't explicitly prohibited. They were enemy nationals, and ships carrying them were legitimate targets if unmarked. But the scale of the casualties, the deliberate locking of hold hatches by Suez Maru's crew, the international outrage, all of it created a situation that would have consequences after the war. Orita made two decisions that night. First, he would report the sinking accurately in his patrol log but wouldn't mention the prisoner casualties. Second, he would complete his patrol as ordered, attacking additional targets if encountered. The first decision was self-preservation. The second was strategic error. Because over the next 47 days, I-26's engines would betray her, and the submarine that had committed one of the Pacific War's worst maritime disasters would join her victims on the ocean floor. The mechanical failure that killed I-26 began as a small coolant leak in the starboard diesel engine on December 2, 1944. The chief engineer noticed temperature fluctuations during battery charging operations. Nothing dramatic, just a degree or two higher than normal. He made a note in the engineering log, increased coolant levels, and monitored the situation. Over the next week, the temperature fluctuations worsened. The engine was running progressively hotter. Coolant consumption increased. The chief engineer suspected a leak but couldn't locate it. The cooling system was internal to the engine block, impossible to inspect without complete disassembly, which couldn't be done at sea. By December 15th, the starboard engine was running dangerously hot, 95 degrees Celsius compared to the normal 75 degrees. The chief engineer recommended shutting it down and returning to port for repairs. Orita faced a command decision: abort the patrol with minimal results to report, or continue operating on one engine and hope the damage didn't worsen. He chose to continue. War patrols that returned early with mechanical problems reflected poorly on captains. Orita wanted to achieve something concrete before returning, another sinking, intelligence gathered, something to justify the patrol's fuel and supply expenditure. It was the wrong decision, but in the context of late 1944 Japanese naval operations, understandable. Officers who showed weakness or excessive caution were relieved of command, sometimes publicly shamed. The culture demanded aggression, persistence, and success at any cost.
On December 23rd, I-26 was operating submerged off the coast of Luzon, Philippines, when lookouts spotted an Allied convoy, 4 merchant ships with destroyer escorts. Orita maneuvered for attack, stalking the convoy for 3 hours, waiting for a gap in the escort pattern. At 1640 hours, he found his opportunity. He fired 4 torpedoes at the largest merchantman, a Liberty ship estimated at 7,000 tons. All 4 torpedoes missed. The convoy had zigged just as the weapons reached their target point, and the torpedoes ran harmlessly past. The destroyer escorts immediately counterattacked. Sonar pinged against I-26's hull. Depth charges began falling. Orita ordered emergency dive to 150 meters and silent running, shut down all non-essential systems, minimize noise, evade. But evading required power. The submarine's electric motors running on battery power had limited endurance. If the destroyers maintained contact for more than a few hours, I-26 would have to surface and fight it out or surrender. The depth charge attack lasted 4 hours. Over 60 charges were dropped, none close enough to cause critical damage, but several close enough to spring leaks, shatter light bulbs, and terrorize the crew. Men sat in darkness, holding on to whatever they could grip, listening to the explosions creeping closer, wondering which one would crack the pressure hull and let the Pacific Ocean in. At 21:15 hours, the destroyers broke off the attack. Either they'd lost sonar contact or been ordered to rejoin the convoy. Orita waited another hour, then carefully surfaced to periscope depth. The convoy was gone. The sea was empty. I-26 had survived. But the submarine surfaced damaged. Multiple leaks required constant pumping. The starboard diesel engine, which had been overheating for weeks, was now barely functional, running at 110 degrees Celsius, making ominous knocking sounds, occasionally surging or losing power. The chief engineer reported it could fail catastrophically at any moment. Orita made his second critical decision: Return to base immediately. The patrol had been unsuccessful. One ship sunk, no intelligence gathered, and now mechanical failures threatening the boat. Better to return for repairs than risk loss. I-26 set course for home on December 24, 1944. The journey would take approximately 2 weeks, traveling mostly on the surface at night to make better speed, submerged during daylight to avoid aircraft. The starboard engine would be secured, shut down completely. They'd operate on the port engine alone, slower but safer. Except it wasn't safer, because the cooling system degradation wasn't limited to the starboard engine. Both engines share common cooling infrastructure: pipes, pumps, heat exchangers. If one side was corroding, both sides likely were. The port engine was just slightly behind in the failure progression.
On January 3, 1945, operating on the surface 400 kilometers southwest of Okinawa, the port diesel engine began overheating. Temperature spiked to 95 degrees within minutes. The chief engineer immediately throttled back, but the temperature continued rising: 100 degrees, 105, 110. At 115 degrees Celsius, metal components inside the engine began failing. A piston seized, the connecting rod shattered, fragments punched through the engine block. Coolant and oil mixed, creating a toxic steam that filled the engine compartment. Men evacuated, gasping and choking. Within 5 minutes, both engines were dead. I-26 was adrift on the surface, powerless, except for her batteries, which provided enough electricity for minimal life support and emergency submerging, but couldn't propel the submarine at operationally useful speeds. Arita assessed the situation. They were 400 kilometers from the nearest Japanese-controlled port, in waters patrolled by American submarines and aircraft, with no propulsion. The options were attempt repairs, send a distress signal and wait for rescue, or abandon ship. Attempting repairs was technically possible. The engines could theoretically be disassembled and rebuilt at sea, though it would take days and they lacked proper parts. Sending a distress signal would reveal their position to any Allied forces monitoring Japanese naval communications. Abandoning ship was unthinkable. Captains didn't abandon submarines except under direct enemy attack. Arita chose repairs. The crew went to work immediately, disassembling the port engine in cramped, hot, poorly lit conditions. They worked in shifts, 6 hours on, 6 hours off, racing against time, because every hour on the surface was an hour vulnerable to attack. On January 5th, after 48 hours of work, the engineering team concluded the damage was too extensive. Both engines required parts they didn't carry: new pistons, connecting rods, cylinder liners. Without those parts, the engines couldn't be repaired. They could maybe get one engine running at reduced power for a few hours, enough to limp toward port, but it would likely seize again before they reached safety. Arita called his officers together for a conference. The consensus was unanimous: send a distress signal, request tow, and hope Japanese naval forces could reach them before Allied forces did. At 0820 hours, on January 6, 1945, I-26's radio operator transmitted an encrypted distress message. I-26 to Naval Command. Position: 26 degrees 15 minutes north, 124 degrees 40 minutes east. Propulsion failure. Require tow. All personnel healthy. Awaiting instructions. The message was received by Japanese Naval Headquarters in Kuri. It was also intercepted by American Signals Intelligence, decoded within 2 hours and forwarded to the Submarine Command in Pearl Harbor with the note, "Enemy sub dead in water. Recommend immediate attack." USS Batfish, an American Gatto-class submarine commanded by Commander John K. Fife, was operating 300 kilometers northeast of I-26's position. She received orders at 1400 hours, proceed to coordinates, locate and destroy enemy submarine, priority mission. Batfish could reach the area in approximately 18 hours at full speed.
I-26 was helpless, drifting, waiting for a rescue tow that would take at least 30 hours to arrive, if it arrived at all, given fuel shortages and the risk of sending surface ships into Allied-controlled waters. The mathematics were obvious. Batfish would arrive first, I-26 would die. Arita knew it too. He'd been a submarine officer long enough to understand that distress signals meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in wartime meant death. But he had no other options. He couldn't repair the engines, he couldn't propel the submarine, he could only wait and hope that luck, which had carried him through 4 years of war, would hold for a few more hours. It didn't. At 03:15 hours on January 7, 1945, I-26's lookout spotted a submarine silhouette on the horizon. Low profile, sharp lines, definitely not Japanese. The lookout called down, "Submarine contact, bearing 045, range 4,000 meters." Arita knew immediately what it was, an American submarine, stalking them, positioning for attack. His options had collapsed to two: surrender or fight. Japanese naval doctrine absolutely prohibited surrender. Submarines were expected to fight to destruction rather than be captured. But fighting required power, which required functional engines, which I-26 didn't have. The batteries could provide enough electricity to dive, but submerged, the submarine was blind, slow, and had no offensive capability. The deck gun could engage the American sub if they stayed on the surface, but that meant standing and fighting a gunnery duel with a fully functional enemy submarine that could dive and torpedo them at will. Arita chose the only option that gave his crew any chance: prepared to dive on batteries, use the dark water to hide, hope the American submarine couldn't locate them with sonar, wait for dawn, and maybe reach shallow water where they could sit on the bottom. He ordered, "Clear the bridge, dive, dive, dive." The crew scrambled below, hatches slammed shut, ballast tanks flooded. I-26's bow dipped beneath the surface, and the submarine began her descent. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, because without engine power, the dive rate was half normal. USS Batfish, stalking from 3,500 meters away, watched through her periscope as the Japanese submarine slipped beneath the surface. Commander Fife made the calculation instantly. The enemy sub was moving slowly, diving reluctantly, clearly damaged. This wasn't a combat submarine, this was a wounded target. He ordered sonar to track the contact. The sonar operator reported, "Contact, bearing 242, range 3,200 meters, depth 40 meters, and descending slowly. No propeller noise. Estimate dead in water or minimal power." Fife smiled. This was the easiest attack he'd ever set up. The enemy submarine couldn't evade, couldn't run, couldn't hide effectively. He positioned Batfish perpendicular to the contact's last known trajectory, calculated where I-26 would be in 3 minutes based on drift and descent rate, and fired 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern designed to bracket the target. At 03:19 hours, 3 of the 4 torpedoes struck I-26. The first hit near the bow, collapsing the forward torpedo room and killing everyone inside instantly. The second hit amidships, breaching the pressure hull in the control room where Arita stood. The third hit aft, destroying the engine room and stern torpedo room. I-26 broke apart into 3 sections. Each section sank separately, tumbling through dark water, carrying their crews to the bottom 4,200 meters below. At that depth, water pressure exceeded 6,000 pounds per square inch. The submarine sections imploded, crushing everything inside to pulp. Commander Fife observed debris and oil surfacing, listened to the breaking up noises through sonar, metal shrieking, bulkheads collapsing, the sounds of a submarine dying. At 03:32 hours, the noises stopped. USS Batfish surfaced, documented the debris field, photographed the wreckage, and transmitted a victory report. I-26 destroyed, no survivors observed. 94 men died aboard I-26 that morning. Captain Atsushi Arita, who torpedoed Suez Maru 47 days earlier, died in the control room when the torpedo struck. His last thought, if he had time for any thought at all, is unknowable. The sea had balanced its accounts. Suez Maru, 1,300 prisoners drowned in locked holds. I-26, 94 submariners drowned in their sinking submarine. Not equal numerically, but the symmetry was undeniable. Both groups died in darkness, underwater, trapped in metal, drowning as their vessels sank beneath them. Allied intelligence didn't connect the two events immediately. I-26's involvement in the Suez Maru sinking wasn't confirmed until after Japan's surrender, when captured naval records revealed Orita's patrol logs. American investigators reviewed the logs, cross-referenced dates and positions, and concluded definitively the submarine that had killed 1,300 Allied prisoners had itself been killed by the same Navy whose prisoners it had drowned. Some Allied survivors from Suez Maru, the 500 who escaped the holds, learned after the war that I-26 had been sunk. Their reactions varied. Some felt it was divine justice. Others felt nothing. Revenge against dead men changes nothing. A few noted the timing, 47 days between sinkings, and wondered if the universe kept better moral accounts than humans realized.
The technical investigation into why I-26 sank itself before the Americans finished her revealed the cooling system failure. Post-war analysis of similar Type B submarines showed the same metallurgical defects in cooling pipes. Multiple Japanese submarines had suffered similar failures, though most occurred near friendly ports where crews could get assistance. I-26's failure happened in the worst possible location, far from help, in enemy-controlled waters at the worst possible time. The design flaw was traced to wartime metallurgy compromises. Japan, lacking adequate raw material sources, had been forced to use lower-quality steel alloys in non-critical applications. The cooling pipes were considered non-critical. They didn't bear structural loads, didn't face explosive stresses. But they faced constant thermal cycling and chemical corrosion from coolant additives. Over time, the inferior steel degraded. Japanese naval engineers knew about the problem by 1943 but couldn't fix it. Submarines couldn't be recalled for extensive rebuilding, and replacement pipes weren't available in sufficient quantities. So submarines continued operating with defective cooling systems, and crews died when those systems failed at inopportune moments. Japanese Naval Command classified the cooling system failures as mechanical losses, submarines that vanished without enemy action, presumably from internal failures. Between 1943 and 1945, at least 7 Type B submarines disappeared this way. I-26 would have been the 8th, except USS Batfish arrived first and delivered the killing blow that the submarine's own engines had already set in motion. The irony extended deeper. Analysis of I-26's final patrol revealed that if Orita had returned to port immediately when the starboard engine began overheating in early December, the submarine would have survived. Repairs would have taken 3 weeks. She would have missed the encounter with USS Batfish entirely. The crew would have lived. But Orita chose to continue the patrol, hoping for one more victory to justify the mission. That decision, motivated by professional pride, fear of appearing weak, and the brutal expectations of Japanese naval culture, killed him and everyone aboard just as surely as the American torpedoes did. Post-war interviews with Japanese submarine commanders who survived revealed a culture of impossible expectations and fatal pressure. Captains were expected to achieve results regardless of mechanical problems, fuel shortages, or enemy superiority. Returning early was career-ending. Reporting mechanical issues was seen as weakness. So captains pushed damaged submarines beyond safe limits, and submarines sank from internal failures as often as from enemy action. The strategic futility compounded the tragedy. By January 1945, Japan had effectively lost the war. American forces controlled the Pacific. Japanese shipping was destroyed. The combined fleet was impotent. Submarines like I-26, prowling for targets that barely existed, represented wasted resources and wasted lives, pursuing objectives that no longer mattered. Orita's final patrol sank one ship, Suez Maru,
that happened to be carrying Allied prisoners. If he'd known, would he have fired? Japanese naval law said yes. Unmarked ships were legitimate targets. Personal morality might have said no. 1,800 prisoners locked in holds wasn't warfare, it was massacre waiting to happen. But Urita never faced that choice. He fired at what he thought was a legitimate target, and the moral weight of the outcome crushed him anyway. The survivors of Suez Maru, those who escaped the holds and reached shore, carried their own weights. Many suffered survivor's guilt, knowing they'd lived while 1,300 others drowned in darkness. Some were rescued by Chinese civilians and spent the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps. Others made it to Allied lines and eventually returned home. One survivor, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Mayer of the Royal Australian Navy, wrote in his memoir, "We knew the Japanese submarine didn't know we were prisoners. They followed their doctrine, attack enemy shipping. But knowing that doesn't ease the memory of screaming men drowning in locked holds while Japanese crew escaped in lifeboats above us. War crimes aren't always intentional. Sometimes they're just the intersection of doctrine, circumstance, and insufficient humanity." After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Allied war crimes investigators examined the Suez Maru incident extensively. They identified the ship's captain and surviving crew members. Several were tried for war crimes, specifically for locking the hold hatches and abandoning ship without releasing prisoners. 3 were convicted and executed. The Japanese submarine commander, Captain Urita, was listed as deceased, killed when I-26 was sunk. No charges were filed against a dead man. But investigators noted in their reports an unsettling symmetry. The weapon that committed the war crime had itself been destroyed by the same forces whose people it had killed, using the same method: torpedoes and drowning. The report's author, a U.S. Navy judge advocate, wrote, "One might believe in divine justice if one believed in divinity. What we have here is simply the mathematics of naval warfare. Submarines that attack will eventually be attacked, and most will be sunk. That I-26 was sunk by USS Batfish 47 days after the Suez Maru incident is coincidence, not cosmic judgment. But the coincidence is remarkable nonetheless." The families of I-26's crew learned of the sinking in February 1945, when official death notifications were issued. Japanese military culture treated submarine losses as honorable deaths in service to the emperor. No mention was made of mechanical failures, poor maintenance, or design flaws. The official story was simple. I-26 died fighting the enemy. The crew were heroes. Their sacrifice was meaningful. Except it wasn't. The submarine had died from internal failures before the enemy finished her off. The patrol achieved nothing strategically significant. The one ship sunk turned out to be carrying Allied prisoners, creating a war crimes incident that tarnished Japan's already terrible reputation for prisoner treatment. And all 94 crew members died for no tactical or strategic gain whatsoever. This pattern repeated throughout the Japanese submarine force. Between 1941 and 1945, Japan lost 128 submarines, roughly 75% of her total submarine force. Of those losses, approximately 80 were sunk by Allied action. 30 disappeared without known cause, probably mechanical failures, and 18 were scuttled by their crews. The Japanese submarine force, which began the war as one of the world's largest, ended it almost completely destroyed. The strategic impact was negligible. Japanese submarines sank approximately 200 Allied merchant ships, less than 1% of Allied merchant tonnage. By comparison, American submarines sank over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, roughly 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. The asymmetry was overwhelming. Japanese submarines failed strategically, tactically, and operationally. Why? Doctrine was the primary culprit.
Japanese submarines were trained and equipped to attack warships, carriers, battleships, cruisers. These targets were rare, heavily defended, and difficult to sink. American submarines were trained to attack merchant shipping, abundant, lightly defended, easy to sink. The results reflected the doctrinal choices, but design flaws contributed significantly. Japanese submarines were large, slow-diving, and mechanically unreliable. Their oxygen-powered Type 95 torpedoes were superior to early war American torpedoes, but required complex handling and maintenance. Their crews received less training than American submarine crews, and critically, Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized aggression over preservation, fight to the death rather than evade or retreat. I-26 exemplified all these problems. She was too large, too slow, too mechanically complex. Her mission profile, attacking warships, was strategically questionable. Her captain operated under cultural expectations that discouraged reporting problems or requesting assistance. And when mechanical failures finally crippled her, she was in the worst possible location with no support available. The USS Batfish, which delivered the killing blow, was a standard American Gato-class submarine, smaller than I-26, faster diving, more reliable, better maintained. Her crew was better trained, her doctrine more flexible, her mission profile more strategically sound. When Batfish encountered I-26, the outcome was predetermined. The American submarine was functionally superior in every measurable category. Commander Fife, Batfish's captain, wrote in his patrol report, "Contact was tracked for 22 minutes before attack. Enemy submarine was operating on surface, making minimal way, appeared damaged or disabled. Initial approach detected no defensive response. Attack was executed with 4 torpedoes to ensure destruction given target size. 3 hits observed. Target broke up and sank rapidly. No survivors observed in debris field. Assessment: enemy submarine was already combat ineffective before attack. Our torpedoes merely expedited inevitable outcome." That clinical assessment captured the reality perfectly. I-26 was already dead when Batfish found her. The submarine's engines had failed. Her crew was trapped in hostile waters with no propulsion. Rescue was unlikely. Even if Japanese forces had reached her first, they lacked the capability to tow a dead submarine 400 kilometers through Allied-controlled waters. I-26 was doomed the moment both engines failed. Batfish simply made it official. The human dimension, 94 men drowning in a sinking submarine, disappeared into tactical language. Target broke up and sank rapidly. No survivors observed. Clean, professional, devoid of emotion. This was standard military reporting, and probably psychologically necessary. Submarine warfare was intimate and brutal. Crews killed each other with torpedoes that drowned everyone aboard. Dwelling on the human cost would make the mission impossible. But the human cost existed regardless. 94 Japanese submariners died that morning. Most were young, teenagers and men in their 20s. They joined the Navy for various reasons: patriotism, adventure, economic opportunity, family tradition. None had chosen to die trapped in a sinking submarine at age 20 or 25 or 30. The crew included engine room artificers who'd worked desperately to repair the cooling system and failed. Torpedo men who'd loaded the weapons that sank Suez Maru without knowing what she carried. Radio operators who'd transmitted the distress signal that brought USS Batfish to their location. Cooks, electricians, sonar operators, lookouts, all doing their jobs, following orders, serving their country.
And then 3 American torpedoes ended all of them simultaneously. No time for fear, probably no awareness that death had arrived. Just 3 massive explosions, structural collapse, flooding, pressure, darkness, and within seconds, nothing.
Commander Fife never learned about the Suez Maru connection. He didn't know that the submarine he'd sunk had killed 1,300 Allied prisoners 47 days earlier. He knew only that he'd destroyed an enemy submarine, achieved his mission objective, and would file a successful patrol report. If he had known about Suez Maru, would it have mattered? Probably not operationally. His orders were to destroy I-26, and he executed those orders professionally. But perhaps it would have mattered personally, providing a sense that the sinking had avenged Allied deaths, that the symmetry meant something. Or perhaps it wouldn't have mattered at all. Submarine commanders on both sides understood that their weapons killed indiscriminately. Japanese torpedoes killed Allied prisoners on Suez Maru, just as American torpedoes killed Japanese crew on I-26. Moral accountability in submarine warfare was murky at best, non-existent at worst. The post-war accounting tried to assign blame and justice. Japanese officers who locked prisoners in Suez Maru's holds were tried and executed. Captain Orita, who torpedoed Suez Maru, was noted as deceased, killed when I-26 sank. Commander Fife, who torpedoed I-26, was decorated for his patrol's success. The Japanese submarine designers whose flawed cooling systems killed their own crews faced no consequences. It was wartime. Materials were scarce. Compromises were necessary. But the dead remained dead, regardless of post-war judgments. The 1,300 prisoners who drowned in Suez Maru's holds. The 94 submariners who drowned when I-26 broke apart. The symmetry was mathematical, but the deaths were absolute. Chinese fishermen working the East China Sea occasionally reported finding debris in the decades after the war. Pieces of submarines, fragments of ships, items that could have come from either Suez Maru or I-26 or any of dozens of other vessels sunk in those waters. The ocean doesn't distinguish. It takes everything equally and holds it all in the same cold darkness. In 1978, a joint U.S.-Japanese Naval Historical Society organized a memorial service for all submarine crews lost in the Pacific War. American, Japanese, British, Dutch. The ceremony was held at Pearl Harbor. Representatives from all nations participated. Names were read, wreaths were cast onto the water. Speeches were delivered about courage, sacrifice, and reconciliation.
I-26's crew was included in the memorial. So were Suez Maru's victims. They were listed separately, one as military casualties, one as war crimes victims, but they were both remembered at the same ceremony, their names read aloud within minutes of each other. An Australian survivor of Suez Maru attended the ceremony. When asked by a reporter if he could forgive the Japanese submarine that had torpedoed his ship, he said, "Forgiveness implies moral judgment, and I'm not qualified to judge. The submarine follow doctrine. Their weapons don't discriminate. Ours don't either. My friends died in a ship's hold. Their crew died in a submarine's compartments. We all drowned in the same ocean. That's not justice or injustice. That's just war." That perspective, clear-eyed, unsentimental, focused on mechanics rather than morality, increasingly dominated historical analysis of the incident. Suez Maru was torpedoed because she looked like a legitimate target and wasn't marked as a prison ship. I-26 was torpedoed because she was disabled in enemy waters and became a legitimate target. Both sinkings followed military logic. Both resulted in mass casualties. Neither achieved significant strategic objectives. The only winner was the Pacific Ocean, which gained 1,394 bodies to add to the tens of thousands already resting on its floor. Modern naval historians studying submarine warfare use I-26's final patrol as a case study in multiple failures, mechanical design, maintenance procedures, command decision-making, strategic doctrine, and tactical execution. Every phase of the patrol revealed problems that compounded into catastrophe. The cooling system failure was a design and maintenance issue. Japanese submarines needed more frequent overhauls than they received, and the cooling system metallurgy was inadequate. Better design or more aggressive maintenance schedules would have prevented the failure. Orita's decision to continue the patrol despite overheating engines was a command decision-making failure. Professional pressure and cultural expectations motivated the decision, but it was still wrong. He should have returned to port immediately. The attack on Suez Maru was a strategic and legal failure. Japan's refusal to mark prison ships properly created the situation, but submarine doctrine that prioritized tonnage sunk over target verification contributed. Better intelligence and clearer rules of engagement might have prevented it.
The distress signal that brought USS Batfish was a tactical failure. I-26 had no good options at that point, but transmitting her position in unencrypted format, even though the encryption was quickly broken, was effectively suicide. Better operational security might have delayed discovery long enough for rescue. At every decision point, better choices existed, and at every decision point, the pressures and constraints of war, Japanese military culture, design limitations, and strategic desperation pushed toward the choices that were made. The result was inevitable, not because any individual decision was guaranteed to fail, but because the accumulated weight of marginal decisions and systemic problems made failure overwhelmingly probable. I-26's sinking was the end point of a long chain of failures that began with submarine design, continued through operational doctrine, and concluded with a captain's decision to patrol damaged equipment in enemy waters. Any link in that chain breaking differently might have saved the submarine. All links holding meant she was doomed. The same logic applied to Suez Maru. Japan's decision not to mark prison ships, the submarine commander's decision to fire without closer investigation, the ship captain's decision to lock hold hatches, the desperate circumstances of late-war Japan all combined to create the disaster. Break any link, and 1,300 men might have survived. Keep all links intact, and mass death was probable. This is the nature of complex systems failure. Individual components function adequately. Individual decisions seem reasonable in context, but the system as a whole contains fatal vulnerabilities that only manifest when multiple factors align unfavorably. I-26's final patrol was a perfect storm of systemic failures disguised as normal operations until suddenly everyone was drowning. Military organizations study these failures obsessively because they reveal how seemingly small problems cascade into catastrophes. The U.S. Navy's submarine safety program, developed after World War II, incorporated lessons from I-26 and similar losses: redundant cooling systems, more aggressive maintenance requirements, better monitoring of engine conditions, clearer protocols for reporting mechanical problems without career penalties. Modern submarines rarely suffer mechanical casualties fatal enough to sink them because those lessons were learned, often from studying how Japanese submarines killed themselves through design flaws and maintenance failures. I-26's death, in that sense, saved future lives by revealing vulnerabilities that better engineering could prevent.
But that cold utilitarian calculus, 94 men died to teach lessons that prevented future deaths, provides no comfort to the families who lost fathers, brothers, sons in a preventable disaster. The engineering lessons are valuable. The human cost remains tragic. The same calculation applies to Suez Maru. The incident revealed how prisoner transport ships needed clear marking, how hold hatches needed emergency releases, how international law needed better enforcement. Post-war conventions addressed these issues. Future prisoners of war benefited from protections that Suez Maru's victims lacked. But again, 1,300 men drowned to teach those lessons. The improvements came too late for them. This is war's brutal pedagogy. Lessons written in blood, improvements purchased with corpses, progress measured in slightly fewer deaths next time. Every military studies its failures obsessively because failure means death, and death teaches better than any classroom. I-26 and Suez Maru became data points in that education. Submarine officers worldwide studied I-26's cooling system failure and learned to monitor engine temperatures more carefully. Naval architects studied the casualty reports and improved coolant system designs. Maintenance officers learned to take overheating reports seriously and not pressure captains to continue patrols with damaged equipment. Prison ship protocols were completely rewritten. The Geneva Conventions were amended. Marking requirements became explicit and mandatory. Hold hatch designs changed to include emergency releases operable from inside. Ships carrying prisoners of war became clearly identifiable to prevent attacks like the one that sank Suez Maru. These changes came too late for the 1,394 people who drowned in November 1944 and January 1945, but they came in time for subsequent conflicts, reducing similar casualties in Korea, Vietnam, and later wars. The dead taught the living, the lessons were learned. Whether that fact provides any meaning or consolation is a question each observer must answer personally. Captain Atsushi Orita died at approximately 03:19 hours on January 7, 1945, when USS Batfish's second torpedo struck I-26's control room. He was 37 years old. He'd served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 19 years, commanded I-26 for 3 years, completed 8 war patrols, sank 17 enemy vessels, and inadvertently killed 1,300 Allied prisoners of war.
300 kilometers northeast of that position rests Suez Maru, or her wreckage, or nothing identifiable anymore. And in her general vicinity rest approximately 1,300 sets of human remains, dispersed by currents, consumed by marine life, dissolved into basic elements. The ocean connects them still, the submarine and the ship, the killers and the killed, the victors and the victims. All equal now, all just sediment in the making, all part of the Pacific floor's slow accumulation of everything that sinks. That's where the story ends, not with justice or injustice, forgiveness or revenge, meaning or meaninglessness, just with depth, pressure, darkness, and time, dissolving everything into geology. The submarine sank itself through mechanical failure before the enemy finished the job. The prison ship sank because a submarine commander made a choice that seemed tactically correct until he learned what cargo she carried. Both vessels took their crews to the bottom. The ocean accepted everything without judgment. And we, looking backward across 80 years, try to extract meaning from events that may have none beyond the simple, brutal fact that war kills people efficiently. Submarines drown crews predictably, and the only certainty is that those who go down never return. I-26 rested on the surface for exactly 23 minutes after both engines failed before her lookout spotted USS Batfish on the horizon. 23 minutes between survival being possible if rescue arrived, and survival becoming impossible when the American submarine arrived instead. 23 minutes to go from waiting for help to dying from torpedoes. The margin between life and death, measured in time that seemed eternal while it passed, but appears infinitesimal in retrospect. The men aboard I-26 didn't know they had 23 minutes. They thought they had hours, maybe days. They were preparing to wait, to conserve food and battery power, to maintain watch, to hope. Then the lookout called down, and everyone understood immediately that hope had expired, time had run out, and death was approaching at the speed of an American submarine's top speed, approximately 21 knots on the surface. Did those final minutes feel long or short? Were they filled with activity, preparing to dive, manning battle stations, executing emergency procedures? Or were they filled with stillness, the calm before obliteration, men standing at their post knowing they were about to die and unable to prevent it?
The patrol reports don't record such details. They record only torpedoes fired, target destroyed, no survivors.
The human experience compressed into 3 clinical sentences. But the human experience existed nonetheless. 94 men, most of them very young, faced death together in a damaged submarine that couldn't fight and couldn't flee. Some probably prayed, some probably cursed, some probably went silent, withdrew into themselves, made peace with dying, or refused to believe it was happening. And then it happened. 3 explosions, 3 impacts, the submarine breaking apart, water rushing in at thousands of pounds per square inch, men caught between metal and ocean, drowning or crushed or both, consciousness ending in darkness and cold. All of this occurred because engines overheated, because a captain chose to continue patrol instead of returning to port, because Japanese naval culture punished caution, because metal fatigued, because systems failed, because USS Batfish happened to be nearby, because Commander Fife executed his mission professionally. No single cause, 100 causes, 1,000 factors, all combining into 94 deaths that seem simultaneously inevitable and preventable, meaningful and meaningless, tragic and merely statistical. The submarine that sank itself and killed 1,800 people was really just metal, mechanics, and men caught in circumstances that exceeded their ability to survive. The story is that simple and that complicated, that tragic and that ordinary, that worth remembering and that impossible to fully comprehend. The Pacific Ocean holds it all now. The submarine, the ship, the bodies, the truth. Everything resting in darkness that makes no distinctions and offers no judgments. Just depth, just pressure, just time dissolving everything into geological timescales where 80 years or 80 million years differ only in degree, not kind. That's where I-26's story ends, not with meaning or resolution, but with physics, chemistry, and the absolute certainty that everything that sinks stays down. The ocean floor is patient. It has time. It takes everything eventually. And it never gives anything back.
His final thoughts are unknowable. Did he have time to think as the torpedo approached? Did he recognize what was happening when the first torpedo struck forward? Did he understand that his submarine was breaking apart, that he was about to die, that the war was lost, and his death would achieve nothing? Or did he simply cease existing between one heartbeat and the next, consciousness deleted by explosive force and structural collapse, gone before his brain could process that he was dying? The ocean doesn't preserve memories. It only preserves mass, metal, and bone, resting on the floor 4,200 meters down, compressed by pressure that would crush any human instantly, invisible in darkness that no sunlight has touched in millions of years. That's where Captain Orita rests now, along with his crew, along with their submarine, along with thousands of other men who died in the Pacific War's submarine campaigns. The ocean holds them all equally, makes no distinction between victor and vanquished, assigns no blame, offers no forgiveness. Just cold, just pressure, just darkness, just the slow dissolution of metal and bone into the sediment that will eventually cover everything that sinks into the Pacific's depths. The USS Batfish survived the war, was decommissioned in 1946, and eventually became a museum ship in Oklahoma, about as far from any ocean as possible. Visitors can tour her, see where torpedoes were loaded, where Captain Fife stood when he attacked I-26, where the crew lived during 2-month patrols. There's a small plaque noting her confirmed kills: 4 Japanese submarines, 3 cargo vessels, numerous smaller craft. I-26 is listed simply as Japanese submarine I-26, sunk January 7, 1945, East China Sea.
No mention of Suez Maru, no mention of prisoners. Just a submarine destroyed, a mission accomplished, a war that eventually ended. The distance between that clean memorial plaque and the messy reality of 1,394 drowned men is the distance between history and truth. History records outcomes. Truth contains all the suffering those outcomes compressed into statistical abstracts. I-26 was sunk. Suez Maru was sunk. The war continued. Japan eventually surrendered. Lives resumed for those who survived. The dead remained dead. The ocean held their bodies, and time converted memory into history, history into lesson, lesson into doctrine, doctrine into future operations that hopefully avoided repeating the same disasters.
Whether we call that progress or merely continuation depends on whether we believe humanity learns from its mistakes or simply repeats them with different technology. The evidence suggests both. We learn tactically, improving specific procedures and systems, while repeating strategically, finding new reasons to send young men into metal boxes that sink to ocean floors when penetrated by explosives. The submarine that sank itself and killed 1,800 people is really a story about systems failing, humans deciding, technology betraying, and the ocean collecting the consequences. No villains, no heroes, just people following doctrine and machines following physics until everything collapsed into tragedy that seemed inevitable only in retrospect. Could it have been prevented? Every single death could have been prevented by different decisions at various points. Don't torpedo unmarked ships without investigation. Don't lock prisoners in holds. Mark prison ships clearly. Return to port when engines malfunction. Design better cooling systems. Maintain equipment more rigorously. Question orders that seem questionable. Value human life over tactical objectives. Any of those different choices at any point in the chain would have broken the sequence leading to disaster. But all the choices that were made seemed reasonable or necessary or inevitable to the people making them in the moments they made them, with the information and pressure they had. That's how complex disasters happen, not through obvious, catastrophic decisions, but through accumulated marginal choices that seem defensible individually, but prove fatal collectively. I-26's story is that pattern crystallized into one submarine, one patrol, one set of casualties, one easily understandable narrative. But the same pattern repeated thousands of times across the Pacific War in different forms: mechanical failures, friendly fire incidents, miscommunications, accidents, tactical errors, strategic blunders, all killing men who thought they were following proper procedures until suddenly they weren't breathing anymore. The ocean floor is littered with the evidence: submarines, ships, aircraft, equipment, bodies, all resting in the same cold darkness, all equally dead regardless of what flag they fought under or what mistakes led to their deaths. And somewhere in that littered expanse, at 26 degrees 15 minutes north, 124 degrees 40 minutes east, approximately 4,200 meters below the surface, rests I-26, or what remains of her after 80 years of corrosion and pressure have reduced metal to rust. Her crew rests with her, or what remains of them after the ocean's chemistry has dissolved flesh and scattered bone.